Chapter 27 of the Book of the Ancient Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Book of the Ancient Greeks by Dorothy Mills. Part 2, Chapter 19b. The Gifts of Greece to the World. 3. Greek Literature. The Philosophers. The word philosophy means the love of wisdom, and to the Greeks this wisdom was the serious effort made to understand both the world and man. To us, philosophy generally means a wise understanding of the right way of living. But with the Greeks, it included a great deal of what we today call science. Greek philosophy was concerned with finding out the origins of things, and from that knowledge to build up a right way of life. We do not today go to the Greeks to learn science. Their answers to the questions asked were, some of them, wrong, and some of them inadequate. But modern science has been made possible by the qualities of mind which the Greeks brought to their inquiries, their passionate desire to know the truth about things, their power of going behind old superstitions and of seeing things as they really are, their open-mindedness and willingness to accept new truths, their powers of patient study and observation, and of reaching the unknown from the known. The earliest Greek philosophers lived in Ionia in the 6th century BC, and the greatest of them were Thales of Miletus and Pythagoras of Samos. Something has already been said about Thales. He went further than the Egyptians and Babylonians had done, not so much because of the new discoveries he made, but because he brought to those discoveries not only the desire to know that they were facts, but the desire to go behind the facts and find out the reason for their existence. Thales lived to be an old man, but neither age nor infirmities lessened his zeal for learning, and, quote, "It is said once that he was led out of his house by an old woman for the purpose of observing the stars, and he fell into a ditch and bewailed himself, on which the old woman said to him, 'Do you, O Thales, who cannot see what is under your feet, think that you shall understand what is in heaven?'" End quote. Pythagoras of Samos lived later in the 6th century than Thales. He was a great traveller, and seems to have visited not only the mainland of Greece, but also Egypt and Crete, where he had many rare experiences going into the innermost parts of temples where, as a rule, no strangers were admitted. He also went to Italy, where he founded a school and gathered about 300 pupils round him. Though it was not believed by the world at large until nearly 2,000 years later, Pythagoras taught that the world was round, and, as far as is known, he was the first thinker who made this discovery. It was Pythagoras who laid the foundations for later mathematical knowledge, especially in geometry and arithmetic, and who taught that there was a science of numbers apart from their use as a practical means of calculation. In the 5th century BC, Athens had become an empire, and the School of Hellas and the centre of Greek learning was found there, and no longer in Ionia. The story of Socrates has already been told. This great teacher did not write anything himself because he believed that it was a greater thing for a man to live well than to write well, and that this particular way of teaching and constant intercourse with his fellow men was the best way of teaching those truths in which he believed. The account of his life and teaching, however, was written down and given to the world by his pupil Plato, who carried on his master's work. Plato was about 28 years old when Socrates was put to death, and for 12 years after that time he travelled. Then he returned to Athens, bought a house and garden — unlike Socrates, he was well off — and spent the next 40 years of his life teaching in the academy. Plato was an idealist, and in addition to his writings about Socrates, he has left us the Republic, the picture of what he thought an ideal state should be, and some other works in which he discusses at great length what things it is most worthwhile that men should pursue in life, and why they should pursue them. He taught that goodness was worth being sought after for its own sake, and not for any material reward that comes from pursuing it. In all his teaching he emphasizes the fact that the greatest things in life, and those which are eternal, are not always the things that can be seen, and that the soul of man does not live on material things, but on wisdom, beauty, truth, and love. The importance of Plato in this teaching was that he was the forerunner of the great Christian writers who believed, with St. Paul, that, quote, "The things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." As a young man, Plato had seen in Athens, under the rule of the 30, the lawlessness and confusion that arose from a tyrannously ordered state, and the Republic was an attempt to show what he thought life in an ideal state might be. His vision is not a very practical one, but Plato was not a practical statesman. The great value of the Republic to the world today is that just because its ideals could never be wholly carried out, the questions which all statesmen in all ages have had to settle could be and were fearlessly discussed, unhampered by the compromises and conventions which beset modern politics. Plato could write of other things besides politics and ideals. He had a gift for poetry which comes out in many a fairy tale that he introduces here and there into his writings, knowing that sometimes a great truth can be more easily driven home in such a form. Socrates and a friend were once talking by the stream Ilissus. It was a hot summer's day, and as they were barefoot, they cooled their feet in the water and then sat down under the shade of a plane tree to rest and talk. And as they rested, Socrates told his friend the legend of the grasshoppers. They were said to have been, quote, "human beings in an age before the Muses. And when the Muses came and song appeared, they were ravished with delight, and singing always, never thought of eating and drinking, until at last, in their forgetfulness, they died. And now they live again in the grasshoppers, and this is the return which the Muses make to them. They neither hunger nor thirst, but from the hour of their birth they are always singing, and never eating or drinking. And when they die, they go and inform the Muses in heaven, who honors them on earth." End quote. When Philip of Macedon wanted the best Greek teacher known as a tutor for his son Alexander, he sent for Aristotle. We know very little about the life of Aristotle. He had been a pupil of Plato at the Academy for 20 years, and had learnt the best of all that great philosopher could teach him. On his return from Macedonia, he founded a school of his own at Athens, the Lyceum, where he spent the rest of his life teaching and studying. He died in 322 BC, 1 year after his pupil Alexander. But if little is known of the details of his life, we know something of his character from things that Alexander said about him, and the esteem in which he held him, and something of the kindliness of his nature from his will which has been preserved. He made provision for all who had faithfully served him, and gave many of his slaves their freedom. He had been twice married, and his second wife, quote, "who behaved so well towards me," end quote, was so provided for that she could marry again, and he made arrangements for the marriage of his daughter. In reading of the life of the Athenian man and the Athenian woman, their ways seem to lie far apart, and the wife to have had very little share in the interests of her husband. In his will, Aristotle gives us a glimpse of the place which the wife sometimes, at least, held. He left directions that the bones of his first wife, the wife of his youth, were to be taken from their resting place and buried with his, and this was to be done, quote, "as she herself charged." End quote. The work of Aristotle is amazing, for he not only wrote on every conceivable subject, but wrote as a master. For more than 1,000 years after his death, the books he wrote were studied in schools and universities, and formed the foundation of all education. He wrote on astronomy, mathematics, biology, botany, and many other subjects, and he has not only been called the father of natural science, but his writings remained the standard authority on many scientific subjects for centuries after his death. Aristotle was more practical than Plato, though less inspiring as a writer. As we have already seen, he too wrote about an ideal state in his Politics. Aristotle believed that the life of a state was like that of an individual, that the aim of both should be noble living, and that peace and justice between states was just as important as between individuals. But he did more than describe an ideal state. He described the education which such a state should give to its youth, the result of which should be not that a man should boast that his state was great and glorious, but that being a citizen of such a state, in all that he did he should strive to be worthy of her. Greek philosophy and science had begun in Ionia, and then passed to Athens. To the thinkers of the 4th century BC, the fall of Athens must have seemed a great disaster, but in reality it was of the utmost service to the world. The Greek spirit was one of those imperishable things that cannot die, and it was to go out from Athens and spread over a wider world than it had hitherto known. It spread first to Alexandria, where, in the Hellenistic age, the next great group of philosophers and men of science were to be found. 4. Greek literature. The historians. The word history is a Greek word, and it means an inquiry. The Greeks were not the first people in the world who wrote history, but they wrote it as it had never been written before. And some of the greatest history in the world is that which was written by the Greeks. These writers were not content with merely narrating events that had taken place. They made what the word history means, an inquiry. They possessed the imagination not only to describe events and scenes vividly, but to feel as the people about whom they were writing felt, and to understand the passions that moved them at great crises of their history. They were the first historians who took the trouble to find out why nations and individuals acted as they did, and to sift their evidence, finding out what was true and what was false. The oldest of the Greek historians was Herodotus, the father of history, an Ionian born in Halicarnassus in 484 BC. He spent a good part of his life traveling, during which time he collected materials which he afterwards used in his history. He was a man who was intensely interested in everything he saw, a very credulous traveller, for he seems to have believed almost everything that was told him. Old traditions, all kinds of miraculous occurrences, and many things that it is evident could never have happened. Though he undoubtedly believed a great deal that was not true, he did not swallow all that was told him, for after narrating some marvel he will say, quote, "I am bound to report all that is said, but I am not bound to believe it." End quote. Herodotus was a deeply religious man, and he lived before the disturbing days when men began to question the existence of the gods. To him, history was a great drama, the plot of which was the triumph of the Greek over the barbarian, which he saw as the will of the gods, and to him, as to all devout Greeks of his day, all wrongdoing, all disobedience to the will of the gods brought its own punishment, its retribution, which the Greeks called its nemesis. As a storyteller, Herodotus is unrivaled. He wrote his history in order that, quote, The great and wonderful deeds done by the Greeks and Persians should not lack renown." End quote. And the earlier books which give an account of all he had learnt in his travels in the East, of Egypt and Babylonia, of Lydia and Persia, lead up to the great climax, the invasion of Greece by the Persians. In the pages of Herodotus we live again, as we live nowhere else, through all the excitement and thrill of the days when Greece fought the barbarian and drove him out of the land. The greatest of the Greek historians was Thucydides, great not only among the Greek writers, but among the historians of the world. He was born about 471 BC, and he wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides was an Athenian, a man of wealth and good position, and was one of the few who had the plague and recovered from it. As the war went on, he was anxious to fight and help to bring it to a victorious close, but a far greater career was in store for him. He was elected a general and sent at the head of an army to relieve Amphipolis and prevent its surrender to the Spartans. But he arrived too late. The city had been taken, and he was exiled in consequence. To this exile we owe his history. Thucydides is one of the most accurate and impartial of historians. He was filled with an abiding love for Athens, but unlike some Athenians, he felt no bitterness towards her for exiling him. The only remark he makes about his banishment is that it gave him the opportunity to write his history. He was scrupulously fair to both sides, and he tells us himself of the care he took to be accurate and to accept nothing on the evidence of mere tradition. Quote, "Men do not discriminate," he said, "and are too ready to receive ancient traditions about their own as well as about other countries, and so little trouble do they take in the search after truth. So readily do they accept whatever comes first to hand. Of the events of the war, I have not ventured to speak from any chance information, nor according to any notion of my own. I have described nothing but what I either saw myself or learned from others of whom I made the most careful and particular inquiry. The task was a laborious one, because eye-witnesses of the same occurrences give different accounts of them, as they remembered or were interested in the actions of one side or the other. If he who desires to have before his eyes a true picture of the events which have happened, and of the like events which may be expected to happen hereafter in the order of human things, shall pronounce what I have written to be useful, then I shall be satisfied. My history is an everlasting possession, not a prize composition which is heard and forgotten." End quote. Unlike Herodotus, Thucydides did not trace events to the will of the gods, but he held that the deeds of men and the use or misuse they made of their opportunities were responsible for them. He never moralizes, but in the clear and reasoned order in which he narrates events, the story is carried down from the beginning to its inevitable conclusion. Thucydides has preserved for all time the memory of what Athens was in her greatest days, and the ideals of one of her great statesmen. But the claim of his book to be an everlasting possession is justified not because of the actual history he recorded, but because of the critical and scientific way in which he made his inquiry, which has become a model for all later historians. Thucydides left the story of the Peloponnesian War unfinished. He never even finished the last sentence. The story was completed by Xenophon. He was not a great historian like his predecessors, but he has left us valuable information about the later events of the war in the Hellenica, the romantic tale of adventure which tells how a band of 10,000 Greeks found their way home from the heart of Mesopotamia, and the Economist, a delightful picture of a Greek household. There is one other Greek writer who, though he did not write history, has left us much valuable historical information. This was Plutarch, AD 46 to 120, who lived long after the great days of Greece had passed. He was a Greek from Boeotia, a well-educated man who had many friends with whom he was wont to discuss all kinds of subjects: philosophy, history, literature, or politics, and he was also a writer. The great work for which his name is remembered is the parallel lives of the Greeks and Romans. These are the biographies, arranged in pairs, of a Greek and a Roman, each pair followed by a comparison between the two. Plutarch never imagined that he was writing history, and in these lives there is no wide view over a whole period, but in each life there is a vivid picture of a personality and a character. Plutarch knew how to choose picturesque details and anecdotes, and he was attracted by simple, upright, honorable, patriotic characters, which makes his book a storehouse of stories about such men. Few biographies in the world have been read so widely or have achieved such immortality as have the lives of Plutarch, and probably none have done more to encourage manliness and the spirit of good sportsmanship. 5. Greek literature, the dramatists. A classic is a work of art or of literature that never dies, a book that will be read forever, no matter when or by whom it was written. We have said that when the history of a nation is recorded in language, we call it literature, but by such literature is meant not only historical writing, but whatever takes the form of letters. The history of a nation is an inquiry into how that nation thinks as well as into what it does, and its philosophers, historians, and dramatists are as much a part of its history as its statesmen and men of action. The great Greek dramatists were men living in the life of their time, and it was a time when stirring things were happening. The dramas of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were written during the period which began with the repulse of the Persians, which included the golden days of Pericles, and which saw the tragic changes which came over Athens during the long drawn-out misery of the Peloponnesian War. Now, the great Greek dramas are among the classics of the world. There are various reasons for this, but one, and not the least, is that they are the outward expression of that love of beauty and of self-control that is one of the priceless gifts of Greece to the world. To the Greek, beauty meant perfection in all that he did, the association of beautiful words and forms with beautiful deeds and scenes. To him, beauty was the same as goodness, and ugliness was evil. And beauty meant self-control, the absence of all excess and exaggeration. The Greek dramatists had no models to guide them, yet they produced works that almost perfectly attained this Greek ideal of beauty. The oldest of these dramatists was Aeschylus. He took an active part in the Persian Wars, and he thought this of so much greater importance than any literary success he had achieved, that his epitaph, said to have been written by himself, saying nothing about his poetry, states only that he fought the Persians. His name and birthplace were inscribed, and then that, quote, "the grove of Marathon can bear witness to his good soldierhood and the long-haired Mede who felt it." End quote. One of the few Greek plays of which the plot was not taken from ancient Greek legend was The Persians of Aeschylus. Interesting because it is the first historical play written by a poet who took part himself in the events of which it tells. The greatest work of Aeschylus was a trilogy, i.e., 3 consecutive plays bearing on the same subject. The Agamemnon, the greatest of all his plays. The Libation Bearers, and The Furies. These tell the tale, so often told in the Greek drama, of the murder by his wife of Agamemnon on his return from Troy, of Orestes who avenged his father's death, of the Furies who followed him as a result of his deed, and of how, in the end, he found release. These plays are haunted throughout by the belief that over certain families hangs a curse, that the sins of their fathers are visited on their children, and that from this punishment there is no escape. Aeschylus was filled with the realization of the power of the great unseen forces that move the world, but he believed that if on one side there were the Furies demanding blood for blood, on the other were Apollo and Athena, symbols of the self-control that could overcome the heritage of anger and of passion. Sophocles lived through the great years of Athens. Only 16 years old when the Battle of Salamis was fought, he must have been filled with all the enthusiasm of youth over the victory. It was said of Sophocles that he had, quote, such charm of character that he was loved by everybody wherever he went. End quote. Life seems to have been happy and prosperous for him from the beginning. He won the first prize at the festival with his first play, and when he was only 28, he won a prize over Aeschylus, who was then nearly 60. The greatest plays of Sophocles are those which tell of the ancient legends of Thebes, of Oedipus as king, and then as outcast, and of Antigone, who in one play, Oedipus at Colonus, goes forth with her exiled father, and in another, the great play that bears her name, was faced with the terrible problem of having to break either the laws of God or those of the state, and of deciding which she would do. By all who understand the real greatness of the Greek drama, Sophocles is accounted the greatest of the dramatists. He represents in literature the spirit that Athena Parthenos represented on the Acropolis, a spirit of reverence, of the serenity that comes when the conflict is over and the victory won, and of triumphant belief in all that is good and beautiful and true. Very different from either Aeschylus or Sophocles was Euripides. According to tradition, he was born in the island of Salamis on the very day of the battle. As he grew up, he became a friend of Socrates, but for the most part he lived a solitary life, not very much liked, and taking as little part in public life as he could. He was essentially a student, and one of the first Athenians to collect a library. Euripides lived in Athens during the Peloponnesian War, a period of restless questioning, of breaking away from old traditions and beliefs, of lowering of the old ideals. The war had brought a new spirit, and Euripides represented it. He criticized customs and beliefs which he thought were unworthy of the best spirit in Athens. He questioned belief in the gods, and in one great play, the Trojan Women, he showed the misery brought by war. He was the first poet to strip war of its glamour and to show it as it affected the conquered. In the Electra and in Iphigenia in Tauris, Euripides deals with the familiar tragedy of Orestes, pursued by the Furies after the murder of his mother, and in the Alcestis he tells the old tale of how a noble woman was willing to sacrifice her life for that of a selfish husband, and of how she was brought back from the gates of Hades by Heracles. The strength of Euripides lies in his wonderful portrayal of character. He judges his characters by the standards of the men and women of his own day, and not by those of the gods and heroes, and he is a merciless critic. This makes his dramas most extraordinarily vivid and human, but it also accounts for some of the criticism and dislike he met with in his own day. Aristophanes wrote comedies. His plays are based on the daily life of his time, and, to understand them, one must know what were the political questions of his day, who were the leaders, who were the writers, the gossip of the agora and the barber's shop, the likes and dislikes of the men amongst whom he lived. But to those who know enough of these things to follow his allusions, the plays of Aristophanes are full of interest, and we learn a great deal about life in Athens from them. Aristophanes was younger than Euripides, but, unlike the older man, he was very conservative, and he disliked the new ways by which the sophists were teaching the youths, for he believed that the new methods would make them irreverent, good at idle talk, but at nothing else, shallow and effeminate. He constantly compared the young men of his own day with those of the generation that had fought at Marathon, and in comparing them he found them wanting, for to him the heroes of the age of Marathon represented all that was best in Athenian manhood. 6. Greek art. The Greeks loved beauty, especially the Athenians of the 5th century BC, but they did not spend all their time in a conscious search for it. They were very busy about and interested in a great many other things: the administration of the city, relations with other states, often fighting, trading and travelling, building ships and sending out colonies. We have already seen what the Greeks meant by beauty, and an appreciation of it touched all these things. Now, a great mistake has been made in modern times in that art has too often been looked upon as a luxury, as something that the rich can have but not the poor, something that has not very much to do with a practical everyday life. But to believe that is to misunderstand altogether what art is, for art is something that is done, not something that is merely looked at. All men have within them a vision of what kind of world they would make if it was left to them to order, and in its widest meaning, art is the outward and concrete expression of that vision. To confine art to architecture, sculpture, and painting is to rob it of half its meaning. The forms of art are as many and varied as are the interests of everyday life, and this belief is one of the great gifts of Greece to the world. It was not given to every Greek to be a great artist. Not everyone could be an Aeschylus and write the Agamemnon, a Sophocles and write the Antigone, a Pheidias and create the Parthenon, or a Praxiteles and model the Hermes. But everyone could work in the spirit of which these great works are the supreme examples. The history of a nation is an inquiry into how that nation expresses itself in stone and marble, as well as into what it thinks and does, and its architects, artists, and sculptors stand beside its historians, philosophers, dramatists, and statesmen as the men who have made its history. In its narrower, modern sense, art is the outward sign of the spirit of a nation as it is expressed in painting and in stone and marble. Except for the vase paintings, Greek painting has almost entirely disappeared, but the achievements of the Greeks in architecture and sculpture are amongst the greatest that the world has ever seen. Something has already been said about Greek architecture. The same spirit expressed itself in Greek sculpture. To know the Greeks and the real worth of what they have given to the world, it is not enough to read about them. One must learn to know them at first hand. To do that, one must read what they wrote, if not in Greek, then in translations, and look at what they built and at their sculpture, if not at the originals, then by means of casts and photographs. And when one does that, one begins to know a little of what the spirit was that produced such things. The Greeks considered that the human form was the most fitting subject for representation in sculpture, yet they were not great portrait makers. That was left for a later race to achieve. What they aimed at doing was to give outward expression to those qualities of the mind and spirit which they, as a people, prized so highly: beauty, self-control, harmony, restraint. The greatest Greek sculpture was, as it were, the answer, wrought in marble, to the prayer of Socrates to Pan. Quote, "Beloved Pan, and all ye other gods who haunt this place, give me beauty in the inward soul, and may the outward and the inward man be at one." End quote. The Greeks lived at a time when so much was being done for the first time, and to all their art they brought a spirit of youth and of joy in creation, yet also a spirit of patience in achieving results, for they were never in a hurry, and they knew that there were no shortcuts to the perfection which was to them so important a part of beauty. Their statues are very idealistic, but their idealism was practical, and though, as we know, they did not always fulfill their ideals, they knew that fulfillment was possible. though the sculpture of the Greeks represented man, not as he always was, but as they believed he might be did he but follow where his best instincts led, it did sometimes result in something that to them was not only an ideal, but something so real and lifelike that they could say of a sculptured figure of a sleeping Ariadne, quote, "Strangers, touch not the marble Ariadne, lest she even start up on the quest of Theseus." End quote. End of section 27. End of chapter 19.